Lipids now, what are they? Well, lipids are, it's a word that a lot of people don't know about, but they do know very well about what they are. Lipids are basically fats, oils, and steroids and things like that. It's a diverse group. There's no good definition of them. There's just a few things that a chemical has to be in order to be a lipid. One, it has to be organic. And the word organic now, in our language means clean and, not using pesticides and things like that. But that's not what it means in science. In science, an organic molecule is one that simply contains the elements carbon and hydrogen. If it contains those two elements in the molecule, then it's organic. All the sugars we talked about last week were organic too, because they contain carbon and hydrogen. Also, lipids, besides being organic, tend to have a lot of hydrogen atoms in them. And it turns out that the energy in a molecule is related directly to the number of hydrogen atoms in them. And because lipids have lots of them, lipids have a high amount of energy in their molecules. That's why things like fats and oils have so much energy that you can actually worry about a grease fire in your house, that they could actually ignite and release a lot of that energy. Also, if you eat a lot of lipid type fats, you will be eating a lot of energy, a lot of calories, and that could also cause you to gain weight if you don't burn them off. Another thing about lipids is that they have a big problem dissolving in water. Obviously, things like butter and other lipids like fats and oils, they don't dissolve very well in water. They just kind of float. And so the definition of a lipid is it's a diverse group, many different kinds of compounds in them. We only need to know about three, and those are the three you see on the screen here. But it's a large, diverse group of organic molecules containing lots of hydrogen atoms, which means lots of energy in them, and they don't dissolve in water very well. So if a molecule fits that definition, it's basically a lipid. So we'll talk about all three of them. Now, the first kind of lipid is a triglyceride. Triglycerides are fats and oils. You have triglycerides in your house if you have a bottle of corn oil or canola oil in your house, or if you have some fat or pork chop or whatever. Those are all triglycerides. A triglyceride is a fat if it is a solid at room temperature. It's a liquid it's a oil if it's a liquid at room temperature. Now, if you look at the molecule here, you can see it's pretty daunting looking. It's a big thing, But if you look at it, it looks like a big capital letter E. There's an up and down molecule called glycerol, which has 3 carbons, and it has long chains of carbons stuck to the glycerol. And they're sticking to the glycerol by dehydration synthesis, the same process we used to link amino acids together last week and sugars together last week as well. Enzymes take out the H and the OHs and they form water, and then the broken bonds join together. So you end up with a molecule that looks like a great big E. Now, you're not going to have to ever draw this or anything like that. It's not for that reason. It's just to show you what a triglyceride looks like. Lots of hydrogens, though. You notice that lots of hydrogens. And that's why fats and oils have lots of energy in them. They used to use whale oil, for example, to light their house, in a lamp in the 1800s because of the energy in the hydrogen atoms. Now, if you look at this, you'll see that carbon, if you remember from last week, carbon makes 4 bonds. And if you look at this molecule, you can see all the carbons in this molecule are making 4 bonds. There's no more room to put in any more hydrogens. So you can't, it's just all full up. It would mean that carbon would have to make 5 bonds someplace, and you can't do that. So it turns out that this is full. And a word in English for full is saturated. So we say this one is a saturated triglyceride. It's a saturated fat. Saturated fats, by and large, come from animals. There's a few plants like palm oil and coconut oil that contain lots of saturated fats. But most of the fat that you see in hamburgers and sausages and things like that, they're saturated fats, a lot of them. Saturated fat is okay, but it turns out that if you eat a lot of it, it might be linked to high cholesterol in your body, or heart disease, or building up cholesterol in your arteries. if you eat a tremendous amount of it. Small amounts are probably fine unless you have an underlying condition of some kind. But this is a saturated one because there's no more room for any more hydrogens. It's totally full of hydrogens. Every carbon has 4 bonds, and all the hydrogens are attached to them. So that's a saturated one. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that those fatty acids, the long chains of carbons and hydrogens, they're called fatty acid, are in basically a straight line. So this thing looks basically like a rectangle. And so if a molecule is like that, it can stack up easily on other molecules and become what is a solid, becomes a solid. The molecules have trouble moving around because they're all stuck to each other. And so it's like bricks to other bricks. It looks like a little rectangle molecule. And that's what makes a saturated fat basically a solid. That's why most fats that are solid at room temperature contain a lot of saturated molecules. If you look at the next slide, you'll see a difference. This is an unsaturated one. And you'll notice that what happens here is that between one of the two of the carbons in one of the fatty acid chains, there's a double bond, two bonds between the carbons. And what that does, it causes the molecule to have a different shape. And it turns out that in biology, shape is extremely important. Molecules work by their shape. And this one has a different shape because of that bond. It doesn't have the same effect on your body and on your liver that the saturated fat would have. So unsaturated fat molecules are safer to eat in terms of cholesterol and heart disease. However, because both of them, the saturated ones and the unsaturated ones, contain lots of hydrogens and therefore lots of energy, they still can cause you to gain weight, and because you're eating lots and lots of calories when you eat these things. Now, what would this one be? Now, because this one is not, it's kinked like that, it's not a rectangle, and so the molecules have a little trouble stacking up, and so they bounce around each other more. And that's why most of the unsaturated molecules, like this one, are liquids. And we call this would be an oil. It could be corn oil, it could be canola oil, it could be olive oil. And if you notice that they call it unsaturated because there's room for 2 more hydrogens. You can break that double bond between the carbons and make it a single bond and put 2 new hydrogens there at the bottom. And so because there's room for 2 more hydrogens, it's not full, therefore unsaturated. Now this one is called a monounsaturated fat or oil because there's only 1 double bond. But there could be many double bonds in the fatty acids, and not only just in one of them, but all 3 of them. And that would be a polyunsaturated fat or a polyunsaturated one. That's the difference between these different fats and oils. In your body, though, you make your own fat, mostly saturated ones, and that's how you store your energy. If you have a lot of food and you eat a lot of calories and you don't burn them off, you just sit there and watch TV all day, you're going to store that energy because your body wants to know that it's going to have food later on. We didn't evolve knowing that we'd have 3 meals a day every day. So when your body has lots of energy available, it stores it for the future, just like a squirrel stores nuts in a tree for the winter. And so what happens is that you're taking all of this energy that you've eaten and you convert it into triglycerides, these saturated or unsaturated triglycerides, and you store them under your skin. And that's why you have that fatty layer under your skin. And if you eat more than you need every day, that fatty layer will just get bigger and bigger. And you know what that means. It'll just look a little bigger yourself. If you eat less calories than you need in a day, your body will absorb the energy from the fat and burn it up. And therefore, the fatty layers in your body would decrease and you would lose weight. So that was the triglycerides. Another kind of lipid, which is an extremely important one, is called a phospholipid. And a phospholipid, by the way, this slide here just shows you the little kink and the difference in shape between the saturated and the unsaturated one because of the location of the double bond. Now this one here is the phospholipids. The phospholipids are almost the same. It's a glycerol. That's the letter G that goes up and down there in the diagram. 3 carbons, and then you have the 2 fatty acids attached instead of 3. In the third position, where the third fatty acid would usually be, there's a phosphate ion. Now, an ion is a molecule that has a charge, or an atom that has a charge. In this case, it's a phosphate with a charge, PO4. That charge is negative, has a negative charge, has extra electrons in it, in that third position. And so what they do is they make a circle around the phosphate and the glycerol portion, and the fatty acids stick out of the circle. Kind of looks like a clothespin, and that's what you see on the right side there. That's just the diagram they use to illustrate a phospholipid. The glycerol and the phosphate is in the circle or the oval, and the fatty acids are sticking out. Now, this is weird because we said that lipids don't like to dissolve in water, but that phosphate ion, that negative ion, is attracted to water because water has a positive side. You remember that water is a polar molecule. It has a plus side and a minus side. So the plus side of the water molecules, the little Mickey Mouse ears, are going to be attracted to that phosphate ion. And so the phosphate portion of the phospholipid will tend to want to dissolve in water. But the fatty acids do not. The fatty acids act like a typical lipid and don't want anything to do with water. So it turns out that we say that the glycerol phosphate portion, which in the oval, is hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means that it loves water and it wants to dissolve in it. The Fa, or the fatty acid section of the molecule, 2 sticks that are sticking out, are hydrophobic, which means that they fear water. They don't want to dissolve in it. So very weird stuff happens when you pour some phospholipid into water, because part of the molecule wants to dissolve and part of the molecule wants to not dissolve. So what happens is that the molecules arrange themselves in the water, like a glass of water or something like that, that you pour it in, into a shape that looks like the diagram on the bottom of the slide. You have 2 layers of phospholipid molecules with the negative phosphates on the outside and the fatty acids on the inside. Because a cell has water, always has water on each side of the membrane, of the cell membrane, the positive ends of the water molecule are attracted to the negative phosphates on the phospholipids, holding them in that position on both sides. You notice that the water is excluded from the middle of this little 2 layers of phospholipid. And so the phospholipids arrange themselves so that the phosphates are close to water molecules on both sides, which they like, and the fatty acids are excluding water in the middle, which they like. And because of that, you get this film. It looks like 2 layers of, it looks almost like like some plastic wrap floating in the water. It's like 2 layers of phospholipid that is held together by those positive ends of the water molecules and the negative phosphates attached to them. Notice the phospholipids themselves are not attached to each other. So that means that things can go through this right between the phospholipids if necessary. So what is this? This 2 layers of phospholipid that are formed by the 2 layers of phospholipids attracted to water on both sides becomes the cell membrane. The cell membrane of every cell in your body, sometimes known as a plasma membrane, of every cell in your body is made of 2 layers of phospholipid molecules being held together by positive ends of water molecules on both sides of it, both inside the cell and outside the cell. So this phospholipid bilayer, or 2 layers of phospholipid, literally is your cell membranes. It's what becomes the boundary between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. And of course, the cell wouldn't exist without that. And interestingly enough, remember we said when we talked about the properties of water that it holds your cells together. And this is why it does that. If water didn't have a positive side, the phospholipids wouldn't arrange themselves in that way, and we wouldn't have any cell membranes. And if we don't have any cell membranes, we sure wouldn't have any cells, and there wouldn't be any life on the earth at all. So that is a phospholipid. What you have to know about that is there's 2 layers of phospholipid molecules, negative phosphates attracted to positive ends of the water molecules, holding it together like that, like magnets. And it becomes the cell membrane of every single cell on Earth. It becomes a sort of a bubble with the cell material on the inside and the outside the outside world of the cell. Now, this is the third kind of lipid. The third kind of lipid is a steroid. Now, I know steroids have absolutely nothing to do chemically with phospholipids or triglycerides, but they follow the rule. They don't dissolve in water very well, and they have lots of hydrogens. And they're organic. What you have here is just the skeleton of the molecule. Attached to all those little corners would be chains of carbons and hydrogens and other molecules. This is just the sort of skeleton. It would be like if they took the skeleton out and just looked at your bones. All this stuff is attached to that, but we don't have to know, what all the different steroid molecules look like. But this is a basic steroid. It's 3 6-carbon rings and 1 5-carbon ring, and in every one of those corners is carbon atoms, and they're attracted to attached to all these different chains of other things. And so the molecules are fairly large. Now, why are they important to us? Well, steroids, one example of one is cholesterol, and you hear inside the word STER, that tells you it's a steroid. Steroids are insanely powerful inside your body. They are very small amounts of them can do many, many things inside of you that you actually need happen. But because cholesterol, for example, is a lipid, it's a steroid lipid, it doesn't dissolve very well in your blood. And that's why cholesterol can build up in your blood and cause blockages of blood vessels and things like that if you have too much. Now, remember homeostasis. Homeostasis was where your body has ways of controlling how much something is in it. For example, cholesterol can't be too high, it can't be too low. And so you have ways in your body, which we'll talk about later on, of how to control your cholesterol. But the cholesterol is extremely important because cholesterol is actually also part of your cell membranes, along with the phospholipids. The cell membrane has to actually be a fluid. It has to flow around the cell. It's like a liquid, if you'll go and imagine a liquid plastic wrap. But in order for it to flow around the cell and do the things it does, which we'll talk about next week in the cell lesson, cholesterol has to be a part of the molecule. It has to be a part of the membrane. And so in between those phospholipids, there are cholesterol molecules. If the cholesterol was not there in every one of your cell membranes, the cell membranes would not work properly and the cell would not be able to survive. And you'll see why that is next week when we talk about the cells. Now, cholesterol is also a source molecule that your body uses to make other steroids. Another steroid in your body is your sex hormones. Testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are all steroids. And they are the ones that turn, little boys into men and little women into women, and little girls into women. Very powerful, very, very powerful. Testosterone, for example, will, turn a little boy's muscles into a man's muscles, bigger and thicker. It lower his voice and have, a beard and all those things that happen to men. So people who are athletes, especially boys, think that if you take extra steroids, especially testosterone steroids, then your muscles would even get bigger. And unfortunately, and that's true, they will buff up and they will get stronger and faster and probably better athletes. But the problem with that is that there's lots of other muscles in your body around your organs and within your organs that could also be affected unnaturally by having too much cholesterol, too much testosterone in your body. So it's a very bad idea to take steroids to buff up a bit or to work out. It could actually kill you and cause heart disease and other things. Remember, there is homeostasis, that even your hormones have to not be too high and not be too low in your body. The female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, very small amounts of them, they're the ones that control your menstrual cycle and turn little girls into women, like I said, and also allow the egg to come to form every month in your ovaries and come out of the ovary and be ready for fertilization. So these things are very powerful, very, very powerful things. But remember, they are lipids. You only need a very small amount in your body, and your glands make them. The sex hormones are made by the testes and ovaries, and a small amount by your adrenal glands too. And remember, cholesterol is a source molecule to make them from. But cholesterol is also part of all your cell membranes. So it is a very important one. It has a bad reputation because people think high cholesterol is very deadly. And it is if you have, too much cholesterol, it could clog up your blood vessels. But, most of us keep it under control. There are, if it's too high, your doctor can give you pills to lower it. Now, it takes care of lipids for us. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see a slide that says DNA. Now, DNA is a deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribo because there's a sugar in DNA called deoxyribose. And a nucleic acid because it's found in the nucleus of the cell. And it has an acid pH. It's not neutral. Now, if you look at the molecule here, it looks like a ladder with the deoxyribose, which is that pentagon with the D inside. That's the sugar, and the phosphate molecule in between them. So the whole side of each ladder, if you will, the uprights of the ladder, are just made of deoxyribose alternating with phosphate. Deoxyribose phosphate, deoxyribose phosphate, deoxyribose phosphate. And there could be billions of them. It's a very, very large molecule. It's probably the largest molecule on Earth. Now, this is just showing you a small piece of it. Now, if you look at the deoxyribose phosphate on one side and on the other side, the point of the deoxyribose pentagon is pointing the other direction on the opposite side of the molecule. And that's the way it's built. They're just sort of backwards like that. But the important thing about DNA is the center. The two uprights of the ladder, it's kind of holding it all together. But inside, you have the rungs, you have the steps. And if you look at them, they're made of molecules that are abbreviated as A, T, G, and C. A is adenine. That's a chemical called adenine. T is thymine. G is guanine. And C is cytosine. And you can see their label there in your diagram. What's important about them is that when there's an A on one side of the molecule, on the other side, it has to be matched with a T. A goes with T. They fit together like a hand going into a glove. And also C bonds with G. Adenine always bonds with thymine, and cytosine always bonds with guanine. So wherever you have the C on a DNA, G has to be on the other side. Whenever you have an A T has to be on the other side. And they form the rings, the rungs of the ladder, the steps. Now, if you look at the bond between the T's and the A's and the C's and the G's inside the DNA, you'll notice it's a hydrogen bond. It's just a little bond between a negative and a positive side of the molecule. It's not very strong. It's like a little magnet. And that allows the DNA to open like a zipper. You could actually grab onto those two D's on either side on the bottom of the molecule and pull them apart. Why is that important? Because that's how the DNA works. Inside of your cells, the DNA only has really one job. Everybody talks about DNA as how important it is for genetics and genes and everything else. And it's true, but its only job is to be a source of information. It's a code. It doesn't really do anything. It's like if you had a model airplane kit, and in the model airplane kit, there's the plastic parts and everything, but then there's this piece of paper that shows you how to put it together. That's the DNA. The DNA is just a code. It's information. It doesn't really do anything. It causes this new stuff, but it doesn't do it itself. It just has the information. Now, the information is coded in the order of the A's, the C's, the T's, and the G's inside the molecule. So if you look at the one that's on the screen there, you'll see on the left side, the first one is A, and then a C, and then a T, and then an A. And then it will just keep going on and on and on. That's actually a code. That's called a genetic code. Every three letters, like you see here is A, C, and T, the first three, that's a word. That's an actual genetic word. It's called a codon. And that means that a cell can actually read that, and it means something to the cell, just like when you read a word on a piece of paper. It's the genetic language. Every word in the genetic language is 3 letters long. Now, ACT is one of them. And of course, there could be many more. You could have GGG, GGA, you know, taking those 4 letters 3 at a time. You can make 64 different words. And believe it or not, in the whole dictionary of genetics, there's only 64 words. Now, what do the words mean? Well, AT, the first 3 words in the left side there, first 3 letters, I mean, make up the word codon, the codon, ACT, the word, that can mean an amino acid. Now remember, there's 20 different amino acids, and different codons literally mean them. So to a cell, when it sees ACT, it might be telling the cell to put amino acid 6 into a protein. ACT would always mean amino acid number 6 out of the 20. And it's not only in humans, but in every life form on the earth. ACT on the DNA would tell the cell to put amino acid 6 in a protein. The next 3 letters would be the next amino acid. And the next 3 letters would be the next amino acid. And you remember from your homework that the difference between one protein and another protein is the order and number of the amino acids in the chain. The order and the number is dictated by the order of the codons on the DNA itself. So when the cell opens up that DNA like a zipper, it reads one side of it. The other side is just like the covers of a book. It just kind of opens and closes the DNA. But one side, the left side of this molecule here, has the code on it. ACT is the first word. It's telling them put amino acid 6 in first. The next 3 letters down, which you can't see, you only see the first one, would be the next amino acid, and then the next amino acid, and the next one, and the next one. Enough DNA information to code for making one protein. That's called a gene. And the gene is just enough information on the DNA to allow the cell to know how to link the amino acids together to create a specific protein that might have a very important job in the body. Remember from last week, we had a list of all the different things proteins do, and boy, they do an awful lot. For example, if you have a gene that teaches the cell how to make an enzyme, let's say it's an enzyme that is working as a pump inside as a catalyst, I'm sorry, inside your stomach to help you digest proteins. What if you had a mistake in the DNA code, and instead of ACT, it said AGT? And that would mean you'd put a different amino acid in there. You wouldn't put 6, you'd put amino acid 8 or something like that. And that would mean the protein would have a different amino acid in it than it should have, and it may or may not work properly. And that's the origin of almost all genetic diseases. It's a genetic problem where the DNA is making mistakes. And they call that a DNA mistake, a mutation. Now, sometimes mutations can happen in the DNA, and it changes a bit and puts a different C or a T or an A in the middle and makes a different code. And you can create a protein from that might actually work better. And that's the basis for evolution. Evolution works by when the DNA replicates, it makes a copy of itself. When cells replicate to make new cells, it might make a mistake and make the new DNA wrong and have a wrong base. They call those ACs and Ts and Gs bases. They can put the wrong base in there and therefore make a protein just a little bit differently. And that might, almost always that's a bad thing, but once in a while it could be a good thing, and you can lead to an organism that's actually better suited to its environment than the parents were. And that's the basis for molecular evolution and how it works throughout time. Now, if you look at the diagram, you see a box around one little portion of the DNA there. It's 1-deoxyribose sugar, that C sticking out as part of the sugar, and the phosphate and 1 base. Now the base in this one is cytosine, that's the letter C, and deoxyribose is the D and the phosphate. That is called a nucleotide. A nucleotide is one piece of DNA. It's a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. Obviously, since there's 4 different bases, C's, T's, A's, and G's, there can be 4 different nucleotides. And when you are creating new DNA in your body, like when cells replicate and have to make new cells, you actually link these nucleotides together to make your DNA. They are the monomers of the DNA polymer. Okay, and so remember, the only job that DNA has is to be the code for making proteins. It teaches the cells how to put together amino acids in the right order and the right number so that the protein will do its job in the body. And there are literally tens of thousands of proteins that have to be made properly in your body in order to work and keep you alive. Now, you see DNA here in the diagram, it looks like a ladder, but in real life, if you grabbed onto the AT on the bottom and the AT on the top and twisted it, it would look like what DNA really looks like. It's actually a helix. I couldn't draw that very well, so I made it flat like this. But if you look at the next slide, you'll see that it's the same thing, but it's all twisted. And you see that C's and G's and T's and A's inside. And the order of them as it goes down the DNA is the genetic code that teaches the cell how to make a protein. Remember, every 3 letters is a code for putting in an amino acid. And each amino acid has its own code. It's its own 3-letter sequence. In every organism on Earth, the genetic code is ubiquitous. It's on every life form on Earth uses the same one. So ACT, a 3-letter code like that, would mean a specific amino acid and a protein that the cell would be putting in every life form. Giraffes, people, snakes, and oak trees, it doesn't matter. The genetic code is the same. Now, there is a problem. DNA is so big, and the place in the cell where the proteins are actually made is outside the nucleus. It's called the part of a cell called a ribosome. And we'll talk about those next week when we talk about the cells. But the DNA can't get out of the nucleus of the cell to go to the ribosome and tell it how to make the protein. The code is inside the DNA on how to make the protein, but the DNA can't go to the place where it's made because the DNA molecule is so big. It's like a big ball of yarn at the nucleus. It can't get out. So what happens is that a portion of the DNA, 1 gene's worth of it, enough information to make 1 protein, will actually unzip and open up, and the inside would separate. And the coding strand, the side of the DNA that actually has the code, is going to make a copy, what they call a complementary copy of itself. That would be not DNA, though, it would be RNA. And the RNA will carry the genetic code. It will be a copy of the code on the DNA. And it will peel off of that DNA strand. The DNA will close back up again. And the RNA, being much smaller, it's just 1 gene's worth. There are hundreds of genes on a chromosome. It will come out of the nucleus and land on the ribosome. And then the ribosome can read the code on the RNA and make the protein accordingly. So RNA is DNA's messenger. They call it messenger RNA. Again, the gene opens up, unzips. The coding part of the DNA, the side that has the code, is going to make a copy of itself as RNA. And it'll be a complementary copy, because remember, whenever there's a C on the DNA, a G has to be put on the RNA. And wherever there's an A, it would have been a T, but RNA doesn't have any T's. Instead, it has a U instead, and U is called uracil. And so one difference between DNA and RNA is that RNA is much smaller, it's just 1 gene's worth. It has 1 gene's worth of information to make 1 protein for the cell. It also has ribose as the sugar. That's why it's called RNA, or ribonucleic acid, instead of deoxyribose, which would be the DNA. And it has uracil in place of thymine. But when that comes out of the nucleus, it will land on a ribosome in the cell. And the ribosome can literally read the code on the RNA that came from the DNA and make the protein that the cell needs to have. And then the protein will actually do the work of what the DNA wanted the cell to accomplish. Remember, the DNA doesn't do it, the proteins do. And finally, we have one more thing, and that's something called ATP. ATP is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP is your energy source, is what you use for blinking your eyes and beating your heart and walking up and down the stairs or putting on your pants or anything that you do that takes energy. ATP is an adenosine molecule, which is similar to adenine in DNA, a little different, and it has 3 phosphates attached to it. So it's adenosine triphosphate. Now, if you look at the diagram, you'll see the second and third phosphate in ATP has a little wiggly bond there. That wiggly bond indicates that there's extra energy in that bond. If you broke that bond, energy would be released from it. It'd be like lighting a match. When you need the energy, your body has enzymes, which are proteins, that could actually break that bond and release the energy in the ATP, and use the energy to do the job or the work that your body wants it to do. Keep your heart beating, digest your food, move, jump, anything that think a thought even requires ATP. ATP is the source of energy. When you eat food, you digest it and you put it in your bloodstream, and then the food goes to your cells. And inside your cells, you have little structures called mitochondria. And again, we'll talk about those next week, which actually can release the energy from your food and use some of that energy to make ATPs. And that's where your ATPs come from. Your ATPs come from your cells burning up your food to make ATPs from the energy in your food. A lot of the energy in the food, though, is not used to make ATP. It's used to just come off as heat, and that's what keeps your body nice and warm. For example, my house here is probably about 70 degrees right now, but my body is at 98. How does that happen? It happens because all my mitochondria are burning up the molecules of food I ate for breakfast and releasing heat. And some of the energy, though, that the mitochondria release is used to manufacture ATPs, and you actually live on those ATPs. If your cell actually runs out of ATPs, it dies. Now, when you need to do something for that requires energy, you break the bond between the last 2 phosphates, and when you do that, the energy is released for life processes, as you see there in the diagram. Those life processes could be anything that all your organs do, from your brain to your the bottom of your feet. And it keeps you alive. It keeps all those things going. But when you break the bond, now look, the ATP is not ATP anymore. It's now ADP with a diphosphate. Di meaning 2. So it only has 2 phosphates and then the phosphate that broke off. So what you have to do now is you have to eat and you have to breathe. When you eat, you, as I said, you digest your food and you send it to your cells. And the glucose and the proteins and things like that, and the amino acids in your food and everything, they go to your cells, and your mitochondria can burn them up. But remember, when you burn something, you got to burn it with oxygen. Anything that gets combusted is always reacting with oxygen. And so that's why you breathe. You're breathing to send the oxygen to the mitochondria so that the mitochondria can burn the food that you ate and turn it into carbon dioxide and water, the same thing that would happen if you burned a piece of paper. And then you breathe out the carbon dioxide as waste. The energy that's released from the food when you react it with oxygen like that is used to remake the ATPs from the ADPs and Ps. And so this is a cycle of life here. You eat and breathe to get the things you need to release energy from the food to make ATPs. And then you use the ATPs to keep your body going. And then you remake the ATPs. Next time you eat food and you breathe oxygen. And so that's called the circle of life. And adenosine triphosphate is your major energy source. Every cause of death, a doctor might say, somebody died from a heart attack. And it might say heart attack on the death certificate. But when you die cell by cell. Every cell in your body is an individual life, and it dies on its own. And so if the heart stopped, it just means that you're not delivering the food and the oxygen to the cells. And so there's no energy going into the mitochondria in the form of food molecules, and there's no oxygen either because you're not breathing anymore. And so what happens is the cells simply run out of ATP and die. And they just die one at a time. Muscle cells have lots of ATP in them, and the dead body might twitch for hours before the cells in the muscle cells die. Brain cells will die in about 6 minutes. So the thing is, you have to have a constant supply of ATP in your cells to keep them alive, so that they can keep doing all the biochemical reactions that require energy, so that it can keep you alive. The cause of death, no matter what happens to you, if you get hit by a train or if you have a heart attack, is lack of ATP in cells. Eventually, they will run out and die. And you have to keep eating, and you got to keep breathing to keep making the ATPs from ADPs and Ps every single second of your life. So anyway, that's the information you need for this week. I hope that if you watch this video, you'll be able to answer the questions better.